have seen over the last several years, really, qualified allocation plans emphasize access to affordable housing in more resource-rich areas as a specific way to try to break down racial and economic segregation. At the same time, we know the housing credit is critical, and qualified allocation plans reflect this as well, for spurring community revitalization.
Welcome to Buzz House, a Baker Tilly podcast where you can find all the buzz around multifamily housing. I'm Don Bernards, the partner in charge of Baker Tilly's multifamily housing practice.
And I'm Garrett Gibson, a partner at Baker Tilly, also specializing in consulting on multifamily housing transactions across the country.
Each week, we'll bring you a guest or a topic in the multifamily housing industry that will help you win now and anticipate tomorrow. Let's get started. Today, our guest in the Buzz House is someone many of our listeners are very familiar with, is such an asset to our industry, and we're very excited to have on today Stockton Williams. Stockton, of course, is the Executive Director of the National Council of State Housing Agencies. Stockton has held senior leadership positions in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors throughout a career dedicated to expanding housing opportunity. NCSHA is a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization created by the nation's state housing finance agencies to advance through advocacy and education their efforts to provide affordable housing to those who need it. We'll be talking with Stockton today about some of the current priorities and activities of NCSHA and other current housing issues. Stockton, thanks again for joining us today. Very excited to have you with us.
Thanks for inviting me, Don. I'm delighted to be here.
Perfect. Stockton, before we jump into some detailed questions, would you be able to just give our listeners some insight into your background and overall work with NCSHA?
Well, I started my career as a developer of affordable housing, first in my hometown of Baltimore, Maryland, then in South Carolina and New York City. And it was really somewhat by accident that I learned about NCSHA. I responded to a job in the classified ad section, for people who might remember those, of the Washington Post. And that led me to a 5-year stint early in my career with the National Council of State Housing Agencies. So from 1995 to 2000, I worked on the policy and government affairs team at NCSHA, and it was really there and then that I got to know the housing finance agencies. In the 20 years since, I had a great opportunity to work in the federal government as a senior advisor at the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Department of Energy, to work for several leading nonprofit organizations in our industry and do some consulting for a private sector real estate and economic development firm. So I've had a terrific journey, and it really did come full circle in April of 2018 when I was appointed Executive Director of NCSHA.
Very good. Thanks for that, Stockton. Now, kind of jumping into a few questions, really, looking at some of the goals that you've had for NCSHA here in 2021. We've seen you write a lot about rental assistance for those obviously hit hard by the pandemic. The discussion has, of course, focused a lot on renters. I know that you recently had an article, even home ownership groups disproportionately hit hard by the pandemic. Stockton, would you be able to give us an overview of where are the emergency rental programs at and things you're working on there?
Well, when we came into this year, NCSHA, as it always does, worked through a process with our board of directors and housing finance agency executive directors around the country to develop our core priorities for the year. And they were expanding affordable housing production, driving racial equity in our housing finance system, and helping renters and homeowners most affected by the pandemic recover. And we've certainly spent a lot of time on that last of those three, because over the course of this year, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program has gotten going. The Homeowner Assistance Fund is soon to launch, and we are very excited to be using special home appropriated funds for vulnerable households and also accessing state and local fiscal recovery dollars. So there's a whole suite of programs that state housing finance agencies are responsible for related to the continuing recovery from the pandemic. In terms of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, that one has obviously gotten a lot of attention. We all can remember 6 months, 9 months ago, there was really a tremendous concern throughout our industry that we would be seeing a spike in evictions and homelessness as state and local moratoria ended and as the national moratorium through the CDC finally came to an end. So far, we have not seen that spike in evictions and homelessness. We have seen the overall national estimates of aggregate back rent be significantly reduced. So it's very encouraging, but we know there are still millions of very vulnerable renters who need the help the Emergency Rental Assistance Program was designed to serve. And even though the program has had a well-documented rocky startup in some localities and some states, it really is working now across the country. We will soon see the data from September, and I expect that'll show something like $3 billion in rental assistance got out the door. Hundreds of thousands of renters have already been helped, and over time will continue to get assistance. And so the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, which a little more than half of the state HFAs are responsible for in their states, is continuing to meet needs that are going to be with us for a long while. On the homeowner side, things are a little different. They're not nearly as many homeowners in the same kind of precarious position as there are low-income renters. But we do know that there's something like 1 million or so homeowners who haven't paid their mortgage in at least 6 months and are probably going to need some additional assistance as various forbearance arrangements end. And so in more than 40 states, the Housing Finance Agency is running the Homeowner Assistance Fund. And at this point in time, the Treasury Department is in the final stages of approving a number of state plans. And once those plans are approved, you'll start to see the Homeowner Assistance Fund come to life in states around the country.
There's a lot of really good info and updates, Stockton. Thanks for that. Stockton, you touched on one of the other priorities. I just want to ask you a question on, just looking at your website, one of the priorities to expand credit, access, and affordability in housing for households and communities of color. Just on a related note, we obviously help a lot of developers access tax credits. We've seen a good number of HFAs add components in their qualified allocation plans supporting emerging minority developers. Stockton, what are some of the specific items NCSHA has been working on kind of around this front?
Well, I'm really glad you asked the question, Don. As I mentioned, advancing racial equity in the housing system for both renters as well as homeowners was not only adopted as one of NCSHA's 3 top priorities for 2021, the board of directors of the organization established racial equity as a permanent area of focus and attention because the housing finance agencies recognize, as I think do many of us throughout the housing system, that we all need to be doing more to create a more even playing field for minority renters as well as homeowners. You mentioned low-income housing tax credits, so I'll start there. You're right, we have seen over the last several years, really, qualified allocation plans emphasize access to affordable housing in more resource-rich areas as a specific way to try to break down racial and economic segregation. At the same time, we know the housing credit is critical, and qualified allocation plans reflect this as well, for spurring community revitalization, for getting capital into historically disinvested areas, which are often also overwhelmingly Black and brown communities. So on both fronts, qualified allocation plans are evolving more to emphasize racial equity. And I also just want to mention that this commitment of the housing finance agencies extends on the homeownership side as well. In just a couple of hours today, NCSHA will be submitting extensive recommendations to the Federal Housing Finance Agency for very specific actions that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac can take to create more homeowners of color through partnerships with Housing Finance Agency. We've talked about the Homeowner Assistance Fund. In many states, you will see a very explicit prioritization of those dollars to borrowers and communities of color. So the commitment of housing finance agencies really does span renters and homeowners, and is something that housing finance agencies are only going to continue to extend and increase their focus on the years ahead.
Thanks, Stockton. That's good work that y'all are doing. And I kind of want to now maybe shift gears and jump into some programmatic items that we're excited to talk about. So regarding NCSHA's goal of supporting HFAs to be, at the center of affordable housing, the finance system, Don and I are excited to see the reinstatement of this federal financing bank initiative to support the FHA, HFA multifamily risk sharing program loans. So would you be able to comment on the success of this program and what it means to have this program back, and maybe touch on what kind of volume is available under this program?
Well, we're really excited that the Biden-Harris administration reopened the federal financing bank option to the long-running FHA, HFA multifamily risk-sharing program. That underlying program, of course, has been around for 30 years, highly successful, reduces risk, and makes money for the federal government while getting financing into projects that otherwise would have to pay more to get it if they could get it at all. And the augmentation to use the federal financing bank to facilitate even more efficient and lower cost executions in the capital markets, which was created in 2014, was something that we were very sorry to see ended several years ago. And so now that it has been reopened, we expect that will only make multifamily financing more nimble, more agile, as it can come in to serve smaller and rural projects, difficult to do deals, facing cost gaps because of rising costs across the board in construction. So the window opened, so to speak, October 1st. So it's just been a couple of weeks. And under the program that the administration announced, the FFB outlet will be available for 3 years, really with not too many changes to the way the program operated before. There's no dollar limit on the amount of financing that FFB will be authorized to provide. Housing finance agencies will have 3 years to enter into commitments for FFB financing, and approved transactions will be able to close even after the end of that 3-year period, as long as they're approved by that time. We are expecting additional guidance from HUD soon, but really what HUD officials have told us and housing finance agencies is FFB is back. Bring your proposed transactions to us, and we expect to see financings begin to close fairly soon. Over the 3-year term of the period, the administration estimates, and we generally agree, this could facilitate something like 25,000 additional units of affordable housing financed for rehab and new development. And we're very excited to be using that program again and to really have more housing finance agencies participate, because we certainly see across the country the demand for the kind of financing that the FFB option makes possible growing really in almost every state.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's great to hear that, you know, you have a program back and it didn't have overlayered complications added to it. So that's obviously a good thing. I definitely want to ask it now, you know, question we ask of pretty much all our guests that come on here, and it's great to maybe get NCSHA's take on it, right? So everyone is obviously watching this infrastructure bill or bills and all the activity that's currently going on in Washington. So, you know, what are some of those key housing provisions that NCSHA is focused on?
When this process began in the spring, NCSHA had several priorities, which continue to be things that we're pushing for. An expansion of the low-income housing tax credit program, including a reduction in the threshold for bond financing to trigger 4% credits. An expansion of the home program, which of course works hand in glove with housing credits on many, many kinds of transactions. We're also supportive of a proposed new tax credit for homeownership rehab and development called the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. And we were very much working hard and continue to work on a new program to provide funding for down payment assistance, particularly for borrowers of color, under a new proposed program that would run substantially through housing finance agencies. Those 4 remain our core priorities at this very late stage.
Thanks for all that summary. Thanks for everything you are doing, NCSHA is doing, and you kind of really hit on maybe just our next question is that advocacy. So really just picking up the phone, calling your senator, calling Senate leadership, House leadership. That is the best thing that the industry can do. Is that kind of your recommendation, Stockton?
Absolutely, at the moment, because we are really dealing in the final days and hours of negotiating what will probably be the most consequential opportunity to expand affordable housing resources for the foreseeable future. So it's really about that direct engagement of a handful of key decision makers. More broadly, though, during the pandemic, we haven't had as much opportunity, obviously, to be together in person and to get members of Congress out to see the affordable housing that all of our efforts and these key programs make possible. As the world has begun to open up, we've been reminding housing finance agencies and their partners that it is absolutely essential to do that. There's so much turnover among elected officials at all levels, And there's really no better way to argue for the expansion or improvement or the creation of a new affordable housing program than to show a decision maker just how important affordable housing is in their districts to real people's lives. So we're absolutely encouraging that as a kind of longer term and continuing strategy. Whatever the political climate, whatever is happening in Washington, we've got to always be showing elected officials exactly why affordable housing matters, who it helps, and the critical importance of key programs.
Thanks for that, Stockton. I think that, to all our listeners, make the calls. Before we wrap up here, Stockton, we always like to, maybe not talk about the crystal ball effect here, but from NCSHA standpoint, looking ahead, let's say, not too forward-looking, but let's just say over the next couple of years, are there any one or two specific housing issues that you're going to be focusing on that would need to be addressed in your mind?
Well, I think the three priorities that NCSHA's board approved this year are going to remain front and center for the foreseeable future. First of all, we know that even if we're as successful as we hope to be in the reconciliation bill in getting more for the housing credit and home programs, we just have a deep-seated supply shortage in this country, especially of affordable rental apartments, but also entry-level for-sale homes. And that is going to take concerted effort over a number of years to really start to chip away at. So number one, supply. Number two, cutting across both our rental and home ownership activity among state HFAs, a multi-year effort to address these deep-seated, long-running racial and ethnic inequities in the housing system. There's a lot that can be done through federal policy and funding, and the reconciliation bill is a historic opportunity. But even beyond that, in terms of the policies and the priorities of individual housing finance agencies, there will be a continued focus on empowering developers of color in getting more resources into both resource-rich communities as well as disinvested ones, with that eye on making sure we're creating as level a playing field as possible. And then number three, while we hope we've seen the worst of the pandemic, we still have a long way to go to get past it from a public health standpoint, obviously, and also to repair the damage that it has done to vulnerable households. And hopefully, with the remaining resources through the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, the Homeowner Assistance Fund, state and local fiscal recovery funds, really create a more durable safety net for the most vulnerable households in the country. That is a long-term objective that people have talked about for years. As a result of the pandemic and the resources that have been put in to respond to the housing fallout from it, we really do have a chance now, not just to plug some holes, but also really create a new and stronger system. And that's something that will also be a multi-year effort that the housing finance agencies will be in the middle of.
Very good. Thank you for that and looking ahead, Stockton. And really want to thank you, Stockton, for joining us today, your keen insights, all your efforts, NCSH's efforts, and thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
My pleasure.
And listeners, thank you for tuning in today. Thank you for listening to Buzz House. To receive a notification when new episodes are available, please subscribe to Buzz House, a Baker Tilly podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. For additional resources around multifamily housing, check out bakertilly.com. And if you have a suggested topic, please send them to build@bakertilly.com. That's BUILD@bakertilly.com.